Hey gamers, ad break time. First, I want to remind you all that I now have a Patreon. If you want to support the show, visit patreon.com/Beyond Solitaire. I'd really appreciate it. Second, Beyond Solitaire is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. Right now, their second game, Rising Waters, is live on Kickstarter. If you'd like to play a peer-reviewed historical game and support a press trying to make more of them, definitely check it out. The campaign link is in the show notes. Thanks, and let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I am here with a very special guest this week. I have Tory Brown, designer of Votes for Women. How you doing, Tory?
I'm so good, Liz. How you doing?
I'm so happy to have you on. So, Votes for Women, we can gauge what it's about, but tell us what it's about.
Votes for Women is a board game about the struggle for the 19th Amendment and the suffrage movement. It starts in 1848, Seneca Falls, New York, and travels right up until the three-quarters of states hopefully ratify the 19th Amendment. It is a card-driven game that depends on area, territorial control, and is a lot of fun.
So, you said territory area control. What other elements are in this game? Like how are the stakes laid out in game form?
Sure. So the game board itself is a map of the United States. Well, a map of the United States as of 1920. So all 48 states. We've not admitted Hawaii or Alaska to the Union just yet. You start the suffrage player gets to start and puts cubes we call political power in New York as the start of the 1848 convention, the first convention on women's rights in the United States. And the opposition to suffrage is called very cleverly opposition. And their first move is it's all card driven. Their first card is the patriarchy, the sort of low hum of opposition to progress, especially to women's progress in this country. And they just lay out political power up and down the East Coast and into the Midwest to represent, to symbolize the inherent power structure existing in the United States, where men not only held and wielded power, but they did it to their own advantage. They did it to the exclusion of other communities. And each player has 6 cards in their hand, and you draw from a deck at each turn. And the cards range from fascinating historical figures, books that were published, self-published like magazines, events that happened, Civil War, World War I, all of the churn, all of the stuff that's happening and the people that are making it happen. And over the course of 6 turns, you move your territorial control back and forth until you call a vote in Congress. And at that point, states begin to ratify or deny the 19th Amendment, marked by these super fun green checks and red X's. And like I said, because of the Constitution, in the game, you have to earn 3/4 of states or 36 states ratify, and opposition only needs 13 states to deny suffrage to half of the American population.
Those are some
It's
brutal statistics.
asymmetrical, like progress is asymmetrical.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. So I want to come back to some of those
Sure.
events and people. But first, what inspired you to design this game, and how long has it been as a project for you?
The idea first came. So I'm working closely with Kevin Bertram at Fort Circle. We've known each other for 20 years. We've been friends for a very long time. And I watched as he developed Shores of Tripoli, his game about the Barbary pirates and the first, sort of the creation of the Marine Corps in the United States. And as he was working on that, I was thinking about what would be fun as different games. And about, I think it must have been 2019, I read that the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment was coming up in the following year. And it just sort of lit a bulb in my head that that would make fascinating gameplay. The history is so rich. There were advances, there were incursions, there was pushing forward, and there was breaking back. There were these crazy characters. There was heartbreak. There was defeat. There was so much chance at play that it just was this idea that stuck with me. So I started talking with Kevin about it, and I really dug into the research probably May of 2020. And then we launched our Kickstarter in August of that year on the anniversary, the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And There's still stuff we're tweaking. We've just got our pre-production copy from our production house in overseas, and these are like the last minor changes and tweaks. So from idea to what we hope will be delivery later this summer or early fall, about 3 years.
Wow, that is a massive undertaking if you really think about it. It's awesome.
It's so much of my life.
And you mentioned in our pre-chat that a lot of your own life kind of led to this game being meaningful for you as a designer. So could you tell us some more about that?
Sure. In my day job, sadly, I'm not yet a full time professional game designer. We'll see what happens. My day job is as a professional progressive, as a political activist. I've worked in a range of progressive movements, from the women's movements for reproductive freedom. It's been a tough few weeks, to the labor movement, to workers' rights, and to environmental work. I've done a little bit of all. And really, my work has been at the intersection of all of these various issues. It's been not just, what are we doing on climate change? What are we doing on the minimum wage? What are we doing on paid family leave? But how do all of these issues that we care deeply about make a big difference for Americans? What story do we tell about them collectively? What story ties it all together and gets folks motivated, gets folks active, and gets folks voting or engaged in the political process? So, as a political activist and as a political communicator, I've cared deeply about movements, and I've drawn a lot of inspiration myself from the suffrage movement and have brought a lot of that, not just sort of emotional verve, but the nuts and bolts, the language, the way movements work to change society into this game. And I really hope that folks, as they're playing, get a sense of what it's like to be a part of something, what it's like to join with your fellow person and to make change. Because I don't know if there is anything in the world quite like that feeling of success that reaches across the country and across the globe if you're so lucky. It means a lot to me, especially in this moment, in these unprecedented times, which, let's be face it, like, are kind of in some ways precedented, right? Like, suffragists were up against political opposition. They had to fight through a pandemic. They had to do all of this work across the country and states. They were faced a hostile Supreme Court. To take inspiration from our rich history and of movement history to what we could be doing and getting involved with and winning now.
That's actually such an inspiring way to look at it. I admit I've been pretty down in the dumps recently over various women's oppression issues in the United States. And I think a lot of us now are kind of sitting here who don't have a background in political activism. We're sitting here thinking, what can I do? What can I do that means anything? Am I helpless? Like, how do I not be helpless? How do I take charge? So, how do you do that? And then how does that reflect in the game that you made?
I would say, if you are feeling helpless, first of all, feel your feelings. Don't tell yourself, I shouldn't feel this way. This is wrong. Other people don't feel this way. Feel your feelings. It's the number one thing we can do as human beings, just to sustain movements. Is to be honest with ourselves and honest with our feelings and draw on them as an inspiration rather than a barrier to participation. So, yeah, and like, things are tough, right? Like, I'm not here to tell you things are easy and like there's one cure all answer. Okay, so once you feel your feelings and you understand that agency is important in this moment, and agency is important in human lives, to feeling fulfilled and to feeling contentment, my number one recommendation is to join. That joining together as human beings, we are social creatures. We are people that depend on one another, that civilization, all of this that we see around us, the good and the bad, has come not from competition, but cooperation, and from our ability to band together. And in political activism, the act of joining together is so vitally important. Almost nothing has ever happened without it. And whatever your issue is, whether it's reproductive freedom, whether it's the opportunity to be our authentic selves, whether it is to have a livable world that all of us can, grow old in, and be healthy, there are existing organizations and movements that are actively coordinating, that are asking for help, that are bringing in new folks into the fold. I think that, people will tell you to vote, and I'm not going to tell you to not vote. I made a game about voting rights. I will never tell you not to vote. But I will tell you that voting is like the base layer, and that getting involved in the long-term political play and getting involved in a legislative cycle, getting involved in committees and hearings and ballot measures and in all of that work, even a campaign, that those are ways that you can join together with other folks that feel like you feel and think like you think, and want to see the kind of, importantly, want to see the kind of world that you want to see. And you can do it together. You don't have to have all the answers yourselves, because you can come up with those answers together. That is such an important way to feel agency and to feel like you are not helpless, because you are not. Together, we have so much power. They are trying to do all of this stuff to keep us from being able to achieve and collect that power. If it was meaningless, if your vote was meaningless, they would cast it aside. But there's so much else and more we can do to feel not only in control, but to have control and to make change. Because isn't that the point of all of this? Isn't that to improve our world and to improve the lives of our fellow people? To me, that's what it's all. That's why I'm here.
And so I'm sure that there's some dark moments that show up in Votes for Women as a game as well. So what are some of those? And was it kind of emotionally difficult to go back and like recreate that level of stress?
I mean, there are dark moments in our collective American history, like, the Civil War, pretty crappy time. The pandemic of 1918 and World War I are difficult moments. It required a lot of sacrifice. I think what was hardest was really digging into the difficult and dark moments of the suffrage movement. Suffragists are people, and they were people of a specific time and a context. And that context in America is racist. Like, you just can't play a game about about American history and not be confronted with the way that white supremacy and racial domination was a driving factor in our politics. And the people of the time are not shy about this. If you read through newspaper articles, if you read speeches, if you connect with the literature and primary source material on any sense, you will find white supremacy and racial domination, and that is the goal and purpose of a lot of this work. And the suffragists really struggled with how to engage with this context. And should they make racist arguments? Should they deny Black women the right to vote? Should they continue a campaign of oppression against Black women, or Asian American women, Spanish-speaking women down in the American Southwest? They were and suffragists were the beneficiaries of racism and xenophobia as immigrants from Europe were moving into the United States in these sort of late 1800s, early 1900s. There's a lot of agita from men in power about the growing presence of immigrants and about their political power. And a lot of suffragists made the argument that if you give white women the right to vote, white as they defined it then, which still didn't include people that were Jewish, didn't include people that were foreign speakers, right? Like very narrow definitions. As we know, definitions of race are malleable and not fixed. That they were arguing to give white women the right to vote would help defeat the power of immigrants in places like South Dakota and out in the West, where their numbers were really inflating and the political power was building for these immigrant communities. So that's kind of gross, right?
They did not teach me that in high school.
I know, me neither. Oh. And so the way that, racism, xenophobia, and racial oppression infuses both sides of the debate, of the conflict, was really uncomfortable. And then having to be straight up about it, and that they're, as the opposition in suffrage, playing a card about xenophobia, that it weakens the movement, and that, focusing on the Southern Women's Suffrage Conference and their efforts to deny Black women the vote in order to only give suffrage to white women, the way that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton engaged in some pretty noxious language about well, why should black men, black slaves, be allowed to vote when I, as an educated white, middle class or upper class white woman, these were the arguments of the day. I think at the end of the day, Frederick Douglass was obviously a famous abolitionist, also very famous suffragist. When he passed away, there was a division in the suffrage movement over the 15th Amendment, granting black men, former slaves, the right to vote, or versus what suffragists wanted, which was universal voting. Why just black men? Shouldn't all of us, meaning upper class white women, vote? There was this big division, and organizations formed out of these different sects. But folks that were on separate sides of these issues still managed to come together. And Susan B. Anthony spoke at Frederick Douglass's funeral, despite this very passionate and huge rift. And that to me says something about even folks I disagree with and about strategy. Like when we have the same goals, when we want the same kind of world, being able to come together as people and understand and respect each other despite our strategic differences is still really important. Now, I don't want to come together with people that deny my humanity. And I don't want to come together and force nice feelings but we're people with the kind of folks that would deny rights to trans folks or would deny rights to immigrants, right? I have a limit for me personally. And so did suffragists, right? But on places where strategy differed, but outcomes stayed the same, they maintained good relations, or at least this opportunity to see each other's humanity, which I think is nice.
That is so interesting because honestly, it really does feel like we're having a mirror experience of that now when we talk about feminism and intersectionality and the relationship between feminist issues and issues that are salient to the LGBTQIA community. It's that sounds really familiar to me.
So we're doing we're having a lot of these same debates, and that's good. I mean, right? I think we should be talking about these things and not just say, oh, they decided it back in 1910, so we don't have to worry about it, right? We continue to have these conversations because our feelings evolve and our boundaries evolve, and that's good.
Sometimes, although we've also clearly learned that things that we had 50 years ago, we no longer have them. That's so interesting to think about, that it's not, this game is not necessarily a pure representation of good, bad. So there's moments of discomfort, it sounds like, for both sides of the game. But how do you make playing the patriarchy, the opposition, compelling in this game? Because I wouldn't want to play them. I'd be like, they suck. Get them. So how do you make that work?
Well, I think there's first just the novelty of it. I knew so little about opposition to suffrage when I started this research. It was white dudes don't like women and they were mad about the vote and that's them. But the historical reality of the folks fighting against suffrage is so big and vast that it's just super interesting, right? As a person that wants to learn and is curious, to get to see these different people's names and to understand how it all sort of played together, I think is really interesting. And I tried to represent opposition to suffrage from, the abolitionists who were pushing for the 15th Amendment and said, the term that was used at this point was, this is the Negro's hour. This is their moment after the Civil War and during Reconstruction to come into the light of democracy and of citizenship, and that essentially women need to wait their turn. And so abolitionists represented as both a big piece of what was suffusing the suffrage movement and as the course of opposition to it too. And we see different, historical figures. Emma Goldman, I had known as a radical anarchist, and she's right. Yeah, Emma, fucking rad, right? Oh, excuse me. And so, but she opposed suffrage because it wasn't enough, right? Essentially that the vote would never undo what needed to so obviously to be done, and that the vote would be a distraction from sort of, full-on revolution that she saw in her mind. So these arguments from the right and the left and the middle, a lot of women that didn't want to lose their their position in society. The women that thought that women were superior in the home and shouldn't sort of get themselves dirty with the politics of the outside of the home. A lot of industries that opposed suffrage, especially, and I think the most well-known and the one who's most represented in the cards is alcohol, right? Like the distillers, the brewers, the saloon owners, the folks that were elected by these major corporations and industries, because the temperance movement was moving right alongside with the suffrage movement. And the temperance movement was composed of a lot of women and men, some religious, some not, to end the scourge of alcohol in our society in a time where people were just low level drunk all day because clean water wasn't available, and the social ills that came of that. So there's a lot of talk in the opposition cards about the role that that the alcohol industry and sort of anti-temperance and some of the 18th Amendment had so all of these sort of different people, cast of characters, diversity, these events that are happening in opposition as well. We're building the transcontinental railroad. How does that affect the movement of people and goods across the country? Different natural disasters that are happening. How does that affect recovery when they're in reconstruction? Are they able to organize all of this? And then some of those sort of negative forces of the suffrage movement, as I see them from my 21st century perspective, go into the Oppo deck. Now, if you just can't, if you will not, if you do not want to play as opposition, we have included, and I worked, Kevin was my publisher and also my developer, on an Oppo bot deck. And so you can play Votes for Women cooperatively, near and dear to my heart as a political organizer. And the Oppo bot is its own distinct set of cards in distinct card text that instruct you to roll the dice to create opposition movements and to have that pull and tug, but without everyone having to actually play opposition. I will say, and a plug for opposition, never have I felt weirder winning as when I played opposition. If you just want to get up in your head about what does winning in this game mean, play opposition for the win and you will feel
it. So it sounds like a whole lot of just research is humming in the background of this game. And that makes me even more excited to play it, to be totally honest with you. I'm here for this. What was the most interesting or surprising thing that you learned during your research phase?
So, you talked a little bit about what you learned about suffrage in high school class. A lot of that narrative was set by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and a book called The History of the Suffrage Movement. Literally, they called it not inventive, not creative, the history of the suffrage movement. As they got older and they couldn't do the same kind of organizing, they reached out to all of their different friends in different states, the different places that they'd campaigned, and they asked letters, they asked for scrapbooks, they asked for all of these materials that they were going to compile everything into one document. So they were working on that years and years. I think Matilda Gage was another of the authors. And some people said no. Lucy Stone is an interesting person in the history. She said, no, I'm not going to send my stuff. Let history decide what we have done and what we've done here. Now, lots of people haven't heard of Lucy Stone. And I think that that's kind of when they say history is written by the victors, it is really creating history is as a task. It is not a natural occurrence, right? And so Lucy Stone was one of the first women to keep their last name after marriage, which it used to, you would call women like that stoners, which now I know has a much different interpretation. But this is fascinating woman that did lots, not just for the suffrage movement, but for political movements in the late 1800s, and is almost written out of history books. So she's not included in Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Gage's piece. When they are done, they've gathered up all of these documents, they've written in what they want, they've created the narrative that they preferred. They set those materials on fire. They burned these historical documents so that all that would remain was their one historical document with their interpretation about who won. They created this mythology of the 1848 convention being super important as the founding of, whereas if you talked with women in the 1880s, 1890s, they'd never even heard of it. It was myth making. It was declarative. It was intentional. It was on purpose. And that the work that scholars are doing now to find these other women that had worked, they broke bones and sweated blood, sweat and tears, they did all of this stuff, these other women were all sort of ignored by this myth making opportunity, this myth making endeavor that the sort of what we think of now as the main suffragists. And so that, to me, this little story about the story of suffrage was very eye-opening about how do we create narratives, how do we tell a story, who gets left out of the story and why. There were very few names in my history classes about women of color in any of these fights, where they were infused, they were working sometimes side by side, but often in their own communities. Sort of why that, to learn why that is and how intentional it was super surprising. Probably shouldn't have been. Of course, some ladies would be like, I set it on fire so I can get to say whatever I want to say, right? Like, of course. But it certainly made me go,
That is fascinating, and also I'm so mad. Like, I'm still mad about the Library of Alexandria. So.
Add it to the list. I'm sorry. But what are we preserving now? Who gets to preserve and tell these stories? We can be mad and then think about what does this mean for us? Right? They've made these mistakes. How do we learn from these mistakes or these lessons, if you just want to call it a lesson? And how do we choose to preserve and to tell our stories?
That is so interesting. I mean, I don't know. I sort of feel like the modern day version of that is like curating your social media feeds and deleting embarrassing old posts. But
Yeah.
the internet is forever in a way that, like, you can't just go burn it all anymore.
No, sadly, I got some posts that I would like to set ablaze, but they're there.
So, is this your first game design, and how much did it change, like, as a game over the course of 3 years? Like, did it look totally different? What things were added? What was taken away? What were some major changes that happened over the course of its development?
This is my first game, and it's just been a wild ride. And like I said, I've worked closely with my developer, Kevin Bertram. I was inspired by, I really like Watergate. I really like political games. So like Watergate was a lot of fun as a card-driven game with all these different like characters in the cards. 1960, Making American President, also, like the map, and right, sort of like in 1960, you're trying to build an electoral college victory. In votes for women, you can just do a sort of straight state count because it didn't matter. Use the electoral college to decide on constitutional amendments. I think there were some very basic pieces of like territorial control, right? We are going to, names change, but we're going to build power across the states, and we will at some point decide like how to call the vote. And so that, like very basic idea, came this mechanic about the Congress, and that there are these super cute little congressional columns that you build up to 6, and opposition can take them away as you're building them out. And that once you earn or you place 6 of these congressional columns, that is the sort of the qualifying event, and that starts to then turn into votes that then you can't sort of struggle back and forth with. There were additional cards, sort of layers of mechanics that we added in. There are state cards. We found that when folks were playing, they would get really bunched up in the east where the gameplay started. And to encourage folks to move across the map, we have these cards. There's a deck of 12 and you only put 9. So it's constantly evolving. It changes through game after play. And it encourages by when you put 4 of your, when you build power in any of these states, you earn that card, and there's some kind of special, superpower on that card that then you can draw 2 and discard 1, or you can look at part of the deck and whatever it is. And so that really helped flesh folks out, that really incentivized folks to move across the map and to compete in various different states in these different regions. And there's another level of that kind of like new decision point that we introduced called strategy cards. And this was fun for me because it like pulled out a bunch of different political terms from my work. And each of those cards, there's like a bidding process that happens. And so you bid on these strategy cards, and then they can also provide different functions in the game. And so that incentivizes folks to, we have, I just love buttons. So I own so many buttons. Just, you're at protests, you're at conferences, you're, different jobs, everybody's got buttons, right? And so the game itself, actually, we'll start back. The first political button was created by the suffrage movement in American history. It was created at the anniversary of the 1848 conference, and part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association released these little pins that you would put on and had a little political slogan. And so from there, political buttons were born, and we have reproductions in the game of political buttons that then creates a sort of economy in the game, that you can use these buttons to bid on these strategy cards. You can use it to do some lobbying if you haven't built enough power in Congress to get called the vote, and you can use these buttons to re-roll, which there's a bunch of dice in the game, and there is just not like, there's some times you're just playing a game and your rolls all suck, right? And like, do you just roll over, pun intended, or can you re-roll, right? And so using these beautifully recreated buttons of original buttons from the suffrage movement, both opposition and support, to using these buttons to roll. So that became like, people just need to re-roll. What do I do? How do I what do I give them? And these buttons now with their various functions, including the ever important re-roll, was real fun sort of development as we were going through design phase.
Oh, that's so fun. What is your favorite button slogan that we can see once this game comes out?
Oh, I have some. I think my favorite, I don't know where it is "It's a man's world unless you vote."
Ooh.
Ooh, right? Like, there is so much in our vote. And it is, like I said, a base layer. I want folks to be writing letters to the editor of their paper and showing up to testify and to go to a campaign rally and to donate to causes and to get involved in organizations. I want folks fully enmeshed in the political system. But that vote as a really basic layer of engagement, and how important, why women spent 70 years, is just because it matters. And one of the things I really like about the suffrage movement is that it wasn't just a bunch of women who wanted to vote. There were a bunch of women who wanted to vote, and also a bunch of women who wanted to pass prohibition and wanted to end the abuse that women were experiencing at the hands of alcoholics. There were a bunch of labor unionists that understood that their solidarity as workers were undermined when men could vote and could offer endorsements and could engage in the political system while women couldn't, and that women were then undercutting the bargaining power of their male colleagues, or other sort of, there's a lot of factory and textile working involvement in the suffrage movement. There was a free love movement that got involved in the suffrage movement, wanting to break down the roles of monogamy and of heterosexuality. There were all of these different, a peace movement, especially in the late suffrage movement, and World War I was raging, that wanted women's votes to be able to vote against people who were voting for war, and wanted a peace opportunity, and wanted a peace party. All of these other movements saw the vote as a means to an end and not an end in and of itself. They understood that the vote was an important part of their political purposes and their political beliefs and outcomes, and wanted the vote in order to achieve that, right? Ida B. Wells was organizing in Chicago, 1913, for the women's vote, as a part of her work against lynchings, as a part of her work for Scout Bloom was talking about the 1927 flood people that were affected by the floods in 1927 in Mississippi. And Ida B. Wells was a part of that with the NAACP, right? It because of this work she was doing for Black people nationwide. And so, the vote is for me, a vote is a tool, not a reward, a shiny thing. A vote does something for us. And without the vote, we are deprived of a tool that helps us create the kind of world and the kind of country we want to be. And so when you say it's a man's world without the vote, right? If the women don't vote, it's really about who creates the reality, who creates the power, and who creates the policies that then affect our day-to-day lives. And so that's my favorite button.
I love it. I love it. All right. So this sounds like a really just a game with so much information. I want to learn more about this now. Like, you've got me interested. So what if I was in advance of this game coming out, what is one accessible book that everybody should read on this topic? So that those of us who are jazzed up going in can get a start.
I mean, I have a stack, and it's like there are so many that are so good. I think where the conversation is right now and where I found a lot of inspiration is a book called Recasting the Vote, about the role that women of color played in the movement. And so, if you feel like you've heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and you understand, and right, you've heard of the folks at the National Women's Party, like, then I think the next step is reading something like Recasting the Vote, that talks about the way that Spanish speaking women in the Southwest were organizing and what it meant for citizenship and what it meant for building out the sort of the country in the place that it was just sort of very new. Women in New York and San Francisco that were working as Chinese immigrants. And I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't lifted until the 1940s, right? Like, women were fighting for suffrage, even though they knew they wouldn't be immediately beneficiaries because of how important it was to their, to the larger work that was happening. So that I thought was really well done. I just recently read New Women in the Old West, which is also super fascinating, and about how, like, when we talk about suffrage, a big piece of it is that the states out west got suffrage first, that there was ballot measures, there was, territories that were enfranchising women, and how much was changing in our country as the map of our country was changing, and the role that suffrage and women and gender imbalances and immigration and all of these things played in. And so that I also was there. Not as much of that gets diffused into the game, because I couldn't change any of the cards, although there are definitely women in the cards that are mentioned in the book. But it's, if you want to think about the way that America has changed and the way that women have changed the way we think about America, New Women in the Old West was also really great.
Awesome. And then before we get into the softball questions, did you know when you were designing this game that it was going to be as timely as it's turned out to be? I feel like this is being released at a time when we haven't thought about women's rights or vote as hard as, I think we're thinking about it more now than we would have 2 years ago. But am I wrong? Like, is this just sort of a weird coincidence?
The I pegged on the 100th anniversary, right? And so the centennial of suffrage, I had no control over. I do think that what we are seeing now, the groundwork has been laid for decades. I'm not particularly surprised, as a person that's been working on a lot of these issues for decades now. I was part of a huge march in Washington, D.C. on the March for Women's Lives, brought 1.2 million people to the mall in 2004. And the concern then that I had about bodily autonomy, about the intersection of reproductive freedom, of sexual orientation, and the opportunity to be free from ourselves, the way that our global policymaking was really harming women and children overseas. All of these things are interconnected in a worldview where we are either domineering and controlling and trying to take power to consolidate it for the few, or the kind of world that I want to live in, that is cooperative, that is empowering, that celebrates freedom and understands that the freedom to start a family is the same as the freedom to be who I want to be. It's the same as the freedom to raise my kids, if I had them, in a safe and healthy world. That, again, sort of talked at the beginning, how interconnected all of our fights really are. And that we've been on this course for too long. And so I am sad that the game is as timely as it is. And I'm concerned that people, are desperate for a conversation about how to claim rights. But I am hopeful that we can learn from these previous fights, that we can improve upon not just the methods and the means, but the underpinnings, the values that drive a movement, to make them inclusive, to make them durable, and to make them withstand the kind of backlash that we've has always been a part of these progressive era movements. There's a lot to learn and take in and do that gives me hope about how we can come out of this period of time.
So, on a much lighter note, what have you been playing for fun recently?
Oh, like I mentioned, like I enjoy Watergate. I think that's a lot of fun. I haven't seen the Margaret Mitchell TV show, but a bunch of friends have been talking about it. I'm like, oh, I know her from Watergate, right? Like I knew her from my cards, and I think Gaslit is the name of that show. I like if I just want to play, I will pull down Ticket to Ride. It's just approachable, fun, easy. It's not right. Like sometimes like I do pretty challenging work. I think about really tough stuff and how to talk about it and how to right. Like sometimes I just want to play a little targy and to right like trade my spices and the my stack of games to play that are still in saran wrap are terrible. Like it just grows faster than my ability because I'm always like playing like I don't know, there's something about comfort about existing games that I already know how to play. And I think there's a tension in Votes for Women about who is this game for, about the kind of person that always wants to read a new rule book and is like, always looking for those new games and always like on the precipice, and folks that just want to be able to replay. And so there's a balance in this game and ways that you, as you replay, that we can increase challenge. Because that's the kind of games that I want. Like I want easy to get into and learn, and then match me as I'm growing more comfortable with. So it's with my kind of gameplay in mind, which is, I don't know, a little lazy, but also wants to be challenged sometimes.
Makes sense to me. And then if people have further questions for you, where can you be found online?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Tory Lynn, Tory. Like, why did my parents name me a name that nobody knows how to spell? Lynn. My publisher is at Fort Circle. And so you can find Kevin there, and we've got a whole rack of games. There's a game coming up on the Supreme Court, which, if you've heard a little bit about that, might be a game up your alley. There is a Instagram page just for the game at Votes for Women Game. And that's got, as we get these pre-production copies and stuff released, that goes up on there. And then I'm on Instagram at Downtown T Brown as well.
Fantastic. And then I, of course, hopefully y'all know this, can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. Tori, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time. I'm really excited about your game, and it's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Liz. This was awesome.
Everybody out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming. Or maybe most of all, vote.